Welcome to the second edition of the Conversations at the Computational Justice Lab. I'm Greg DeAngelo, the director of the Computational Justice Lab. And on this edition, I have my good friend and frequent co-author, Bryan McCannon, who is an associate professor of economics at West Virginia University and the associate director of the Center for Free Enterprise at West Virginia University as well. Bryan, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me out, Greg.
Of course. So, Bryan, your research, you research in a number of different areas, but a large strand of your research pertains to empirical legal issues. Why do you focus on these issues?
Sure. So, kind of there's two words in that question, right? Empirical and legal. So I'll take one at a time, right? So why study the legal system? I think that's how our society is organized, right? Like whether it is protecting yourself and your property and the accumulation of the things you have in your house, right? And wanting it protected. Whether it's contracts you sign at work, trade, buying, selling. At the heart of everything we do day to day, we have a legal system kind of in the shadows backing us up, right? It's how we interact with one another and how we prosper is by having a strong legal system. And some people study the law and they go to law school and they do that for a living, but we all benefit from it, right? And so, my training is in economics, right? And, in economics, we're trying to understand how to prosper and how to make society better. And so an important part of that is having a well-functioning legal system. And outside the country, when you see those less developed, impoverished areas of the world, it almost goes lockstep that they have malfunctioning legal systems, right? And so whether it's understanding how to prosper in the United States or outside the world, the legal system becomes crucial. So so over my career, I've just become more aware of the role it has. And therefore, I've been wanting to spend more of my research efforts understanding how it functions and what goes wrong. Yeah. And so then on the empirical side, why empirical? Well, because that's the world, right? Like you want to understand how it works? Well, let's go get some data. Let's go observe how it works. And then, that's one thing that empirical researchers, that the skills they built is how to make the data sing and tell you what is going on. And look at two different states that might have different systems, right? Go get data. Let's see how they're different, right? Yeah. And so that's what makes empirical legal studies fun.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I tend to share that sentiment with you.
Especially work together on some things.
That's right. So you actually introduced me to a strand of economics that I didn't know that I belonged to, even though I very much belong to it, which is the strand of public choice research. And I think that's what part of your empirical legal research that makes it so fascinating is there's lots of really talented empirical legal researchers out there, but your work kind of sits at the nexus of public choice research and legal scholarship, empirical legal scholarship. So can you kind of tell us what is it about the intersection of those two things that makes kind of your research set apart from other empirical legal researchers?
So the term public choice is just this name that's been put on a set of questions, right? And so even in economics, a lot of people don't even really appreciate what public choice even is, right? And I don't know, it seems very obvious to me, but maybe it's the way I look at things, right? That what public choice research is broadly is saying, let's get rid of these assumptions that that policymakers are interested in maximizing like the well-being of society. Like there are these benevolent people up in the clouds who say, let's just do what's best for everybody, right? Yep. And to take more realistic assumptions that those people who are put in positions of power and decision-making and elected offices or have objectives and preferences and that they're going to respond day to day like they're going to work. It just happens to be that their work affects us, right? More than the state of McDonald's work. He goes to work, yes, if I bought a cheeseburger, it matters how good he did, but if I don't go to McDonald's, it doesn't matter, right? But the judge, the elected representative, the bureaucrat in D.C., like their choices are affecting all of us. Yeah. And so public choice is just kind of pulling out those questions where we're saying, let's take seriously the incentives of the people who are making these choices, right? And so from that perspective, maybe it's because of my economics background, but it seems like the obvious place to study the legal system, right? Yeah. Is like this system is made up of people who are just going to work every day, right? Whether the law enforcement on the streets, the prosecutors handling the cases, judges making their decisions, or think about arbitrators or attorneys. Let's think about their system, and how do we respond? We care about basic things, right? We care about how much money we make.
Yeah.
We care about our leisure and free time. But most people care about their job and doing it well. But they might have different ideas of what's good, and they're going to trade off their free time and their leisure, and also their ideology is part of that, like their views of what is good and not good that we often disagree on, and that's all going to be expressed in their jobs.
Yep.
Right. And so by taking public choice ideas, which normally public choice scholars are like, how do elected representatives vote on issues, or how do bureaucrats regulate? Right. Well, public choice and legal systems like, well, how do judges or prosecutors or law enforcement, how do they handle their job given what they think is right and what their preferences are and the stuff that's mattering for their life? And then the rules of the game, right, end up influencing how they handle their job, right? Whether it's trying to get the next promotion or get the next raise. And so that's what the public choice in the legal research field is working on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the people, I'll say this in jest, Bryan does not pick on prosecutors, but one of the areas that you spend a lot of time thinking about in terms of one of these individuals in the legal system and the public choice incentives that individual might face is the prosecutor, right? Your district attorneys. And you spend a lot of time, I think, thinking about the pressure that prosecutors face within the office, but also the external pressures that are imposing on that office. What have you learned from this research? Tell us a little bit about it.
What got me into the prosecutors was when I started thinking about these things years ago. Every time I picked up papers about judges, right? And I'm like, for good reason, including the Supreme Court, we write books about these guys, right? And we read about what they're up to. But then as I started to learn about how the legal system functions, I realized that the guys who really have the discretion, who are really pulling the strings in the background, are the prosecutors. They're making their basic choices of what charges to file, whether or not to even bother pursuing a conviction against this person, how harshly, and for they make so many choices with regards to the prosecution and sentencing of these individuals that I really wanted to focus on them, right? And so that got me motivated in getting interested in prosecutors. And then when I started learning about prosecutors in the United States and how we're different as a country, it becomes very, very stark, right? We're the only developed country that uses popular, typically partisan elections to select these guys, right? That's outside the U.S. That's crazy. We're going to let voters who don't even know the name of their prosecutor, clearly have never gone to law school, except for a tiny little percentage of them, right? And have no idea what of the facts of the case, but they're going to be the ones who judge who's doing a good job or not. Just seemed crazy to me. And so I wanted to get that understanding of how these types of pressures, given all the discretion that they have, right, and the kind of the minimal oversight and accountability checks they have to deal with, understand what's going on with these guys.
Absolutely. So one part of that is so fascinating, largely I think because it's a black box, is this plea bargaining process. And the term gets thrown around, and I think that people are like, oh yeah, the plea bargaining process, but it seems like an opaque part of the process that you are trying to shine some light on and learn and educate the rest of us about. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're learning about that part of the process?
So prosecutors and plea bargaining, right? Like another thing that's unique about our system is how much we use this process called plea bargaining. Now we are kind of quote unquote infecting the rest of the world right now as other countries are trying to come up with American style systems to save themselves a lot of cost because our criminal justice system is very expensive. It's a pretty large tax burden that the typical American has to deal with. And given the large volumes of crime and given the public finance pressures, right? Plea bargaining, working out a deal rather than going through all the cost and effort of trials and the whole process is kind of an efficient thing from an economic perspective, especially if everybody has kind of reasonable expectation of what's going to happen. If we go in front of the jury, let's just agree to it beforehand, save ourselves a lot of time and effort, right? And so there's an efficiency side to the plea bargaining process. And so when economists look at plea bargaining, like, why doesn't it happen all the time? Right? It's like going to war. Like we should have figured out how to avoid that in the first place, right? Like that's extreme, but maybe if you're accused and you're going to jail, it is equivalent. It's a high stakes situation.
Absolutely.
And so, the idea is, some people look at it, we plea bargain too much, but it comes like, well, it seems extremely efficient. And so I'm trying to understand exactly how prosecutors and the incentives that they're facing, and there's this tool that they have that other countries, they don't really use this ability just to negotiate the outcome outside of the courtroom, how the courtroom functions. And so one of those questions, I won't belabor it too long, but one of the things is like, well, what's going on at the bargaining table, right? Given that people get different outcomes, there's disparities, we have high incarceration populations, like, so what is it that's causing these sentences to be harsh and different, and so how does this bargaining process work? And at the top of the food chain is what's going on in the courtroom rearing its head at the bargaining table, or is there enough like disjoint, kind of wedge between the two that the two are unrelated? And so that's what my research recently has been trying to figure out is if we see changes in what we expect to happen in the courtroom go on, does that trickle back to the bargaining process and change? And this is kind of an important question because for the most part, we don't regulate plea bargaining. The Supreme Court doesn't really want to touch it. We have separation of powers keeps the legislative branch out of the plea bargaining process, and people are worried that there's threats and coercive threats, incredible things going on. Rules of evidence don't apply when we're just sitting at a table negotiating, right? And so you could be concerned that some funky stuff is going on down there. And so that's what my recent research has been trying to figure out. And it seems like there's enough translation. So when things change in the courtroom, plea bargaining kind of corresponds. That is probably reflecting what's happening in trials.
Okay. Yeah. So there's something good there.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so you have accumulated just an incredible amount of knowledge about the legal system. I know, you're my friend. I know you're a voracious reader of legal opinions, and I every time I sit down with you, I feel like I learn a ton. And hopefully, we're gonna have lots of viewers out there that are gonna be listening to this. So, what's the $1 million question? Here's the $1 million question: what do we not know about prosecutors or the legal system that we should know?
Right. So, I got two parts to the question. Right, one is like, what as lay people, like citizens of the world, what do we not know? And as researchers, what do we not know? Right. So on the lay person, one thing that keeps coming up in my research and plenty of other folks when they're looking at judges and stuff like this, right, is on the surface you look at this voting mechanisms we use, which I alluded to earlier, and you would think that all the incentives are wrong. Right, like voters don't know anything about what is good attorneys and bad attorneys, what to be handling these cases. Plus, what's the chance your vote matters? It's about zero. Right, like you should feel good about voting, like you did your civic duty, but the chance that one vote swings the outcome is virtually zero. Right, and so this is a public goods problem. Right, why should voters be exerting effort to become informed when there's no chance, and they really don't have the knowledge to really know what good looks like? And so there's a lot of question marks to have about the voting mechanisms we use. But what I find in my research on prosecutors and what other people have found on judges is that the election cycles very much influence their outcome and what they do. We see cycles, whether it's how harsh judges sentence, how often prosecutors take cases to trial. This moves with the election cycle. So these guys are responding to these electoral pressures, even if voters aren't super informed about it. So from the layperson's perspective, here's an opportunity for democracy to kind of function. Like if you don't like what's going on in the criminal justice system, right? These guys are reading the tea leaves and trying to figure out how to keep their job. You know what I mean? And so one would imagine that voter information and voter motivation could have the possibility to have policy reforms. And so for the layperson, I would really, what we've learned is that they're very responsive to the electoral mechanism, and that's a margin to push on. Right. And so on the research side, I think we got that figured out. On the research side, one thing I'm fascinated with, I don't think we fully understand, is when we think about the criminal justice system, we're thinking about the sentences and how harsh, how long your sentence is, whether you have to get incarceration, and this kind of negotiation that goes on at the front end, right, at pre-trial and at the trial. But then when we lock people up for a long time, and we're not really sure when they get out. They get out at some point. But everything is kind of indeterminate and gray. We have parole boards, right, that are making these decisions, you know what I mean? And I don't think at the front end anybody there's a lot of ambiguity in this system, right? Like nobody exactly knows what we're negotiating over and what the outcome really is, because we're not, we might have a range of when you get released kind of thing, right? And this, when we release and those kind of decisions, I don't think we would have the empirical world, the research world, really has any idea what's going on in that back end. And so I think that's like the future questions to go after.
Absolutely, and I hope we get to work on those together with the lab. So we're almost out of time here, but I want to ask you one question. I try to ask every guest that's going to come through here. You researchers are producing such interesting work, but you're influenced by other people's work.
Yeah.
And if people are watching and they're kind of looking for a good read or something that it really had a lot of influence over you, or you think it's having a lot of influence over the way that you look at the world. What is that piece of work? So if you can kind of throw a bone to the rest of us, and, hey, here's something you should check out. What is that? Tell us about it.
So the one that stood out was a paper by a woman I know named Joanna Shepard. It's back in 2009, I think, was when it finally saw print, right?
Yeah.
It's in the Journal Legal Studies. And it's what actually got me started on this project. When I read the working paper version a long time ago, what actually got me started in this public choice and prosecutors line. She's got a data set where she's looking at high court judges across states and their rulings on cases that come before these high courts, right? And she was specifically focused on like partisan ideology. Mm-hmm. So she was looking at when you have a labor management dispute, typically Republicans side with management, Democrats side with labor, or in environmental disputes, Republicans are on the business side, there's the Democrat position. And so she can kind of code up these decisions whether they're kind of more Republican or more Democrat, right? And so so before that work, I just thought everything was about like just partisan ideology. There are Republican judges, there are Democrat judges. Who appoints you is who you are for the rest of your life, right? And what she showed was that as you change the retention agent, whether it's governor in a state or the median voter, these judges will start flipping their votes, right? So if you were put in by Democrats, like yes, environment, yes, labor, right? Until the Republicans take over, right? Like, yes, business, right? Like literally you're seeing the change. And that's just fascinating me because before that, I'd only been exposed to this kind of ideology differences, right? Republicans, Democrats, Democrats. But that's when I started thinking about these guys are just dudes trying to keep their job. Right, and so that's what kind of stuck out to me when she showed those results, and so that's when I started thinking, what about prosecutors just handling their job, and that really got me motivated to start working on them. So I'd go back and read that paper. It's a little bit older, but
yeah, I'm familiar with that one. So that's a great paper, good recommendation. All right, so we are out of time here today. Unfortunately, I could spend quite a bit of time talking with Bryan. Thanks for watching the Conversations, the Computational Justice Lab. Be on the lookout for our next episode, which you can find at our webpage. You can also find out about the lab's activities at the website, as well as by liking us on Facebook or following us on Twitter. And once again, thanks to Bryan for being here.
Good fun. Thanks, Greg.